Today, we're tackling a subject that is so enduring, so globally recognizable, it's actually hard to imagine a world without it. We're talking about the history of chess. And you should forget that image of, dusty libraries and old men contemplating a board. Modern chess is a massive industry. It's valued at $190 million, and it's played regularly by over 605 million people.
It's an absolutely remarkable cultural artifact. This isn't just a game. I mean, it's a 1,500-year lineage of strategy. It's the game of kings in a very literal sense.
Right.
And our mission today is really to trace that history, to look at how culture, politics, and, more recently, technology have completely shaped those 64 squares.
Absolutely. The game we play today it's a culmination of centuries of evolution and rivalry. So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's start at the very beginning. Where is the cradle of the 8x8 board?
All the strongest evidence, the research we can really rely on, it all points directly to 6th century India. The accepted origin is a game called Chaturanga.
Chaturanga? Okay, and what does that name tell us about what the game was supposed to be?
It's incredibly descriptive. Chaturanga literally means 4 divisions. It was designed as a simulation of the ancient Indian army. So you had your footmen, elephants, chariots, and cavalry.
So those are the direct ancestors of our pieces today.
Exactly. Those are the 4 divisions that later evolved into our pawns, bishops, rooks, and knights. And it was played on an 8x8 board, the Ashtapada, but it wasn't checkered yet. That came later.
Okay.
But the key idea was already there from the start. The entire battle, the whole simulation, it all came down to the fate of one single piece.
The king.
The king.
So it starts as this really detailed army simulation. How does it start its journey out of India?
Well, it spreads along the big trade routes, especially the Silk Road. And it makes its way very quickly to Sassanid Persia. And there it evolves into a game called Shatrang.
And this Persian phase is important.
It's absolutely crucial, because the Persians gifted us the iconic terminology that still defines the game everywhere. They set the linguistic standard for, the next millennium and a half.
They gave us the language of the game, so if the king was in danger, they'd declare.
They would declare Shah, which means king, and that's exactly where we get our word check.
Wow, okay.
And when the king was trapped,
Yeah.
completely helpless, they would announce Shamat.
And is Shamat just the king is dead, or is there something more to it?
That's a great question, because the nuance is really telling. It translates more accurately to the king is helpless, or even the king is abandoned. It implies the king is still on the board, still alive, but totally cornered, unable to move. And that subtlety, that reflects this immense cultural reverence for the monarch even in defeat. It's a powerful metaphor that survives right into our modern checkmate.
That reverence is palpable. Okay, so after the 7th century Islamic conquest of Persia, the history of chess gets tied up with the Islamic Golden Age.
It does. The Arab world adopted the game. They renamed it Shatranj. And here, it became more than just a pastime. It was a tool for intellectual development.
Like a mental exercise.
A very serious one.
Yeah.
It was so valued as a way to teach logic and strategy that Caliph Harun al-Rashid reportedly made it mandatory in his court.
And this is where the pieces themselves change visually, right? They move away from being realistic little figures.
Precisely. Unlike the Indian versions, Islamic sets featured these abstract geometric shapes. This visual abstraction was rooted in an interpretation of the Quran about the ban on idols, meaning they avoided any true-to-life images of soldiers or animals.
And that's a really critical pivot point.
It is, because it's this abstracted game of Shatranj that finally makes its way to Europe.
So how did it travel? How did it get from the Middle East into Western Europe?
Well, the Islamic Caliphate carried the game across North Africa and then up into Moorish Spain by the 10th century. That was the gateway.
Okay, so Spain is the entry point.
Right. And from the Iberian Peninsula, through trade, through conquering cultures, it just spread like wildfire. It reached the Byzantine Empire, then Russia, and eventually the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Some think it was carried to England with William the Conqueror. The game had gone truly global.
And once it's in Europe, the sort of Christian feudal cultures start reinterpreting those abstract pieces.
Exactly. European culture just imposes itself directly onto the pieces. Let's take the Indian elephant piece. In the Muslim game, it was abstracted down to just a shape with a little notch at the top.
Okay.
When Europeans saw that shape, Their interpretation depended entirely on local culture.
So some people saw a bishop's hat.
Exactly. In Southern Europe, that notch looked like a bishop's mitre, so the piece became the bishop. But at the same time in France, they thought the notch looked more like a jester's cap.
So it became the fool.
It became the fool. It just shows how fluid the meaning of these symbols was as they were absorbed into new social structures.
But the one change that completely remade the game, that took it from this slow, strategic grind to what we know today, that was the queen.
That is the single most critical evolution in the game's entire history. The piece next to the king was originally the advisor, the Farzin, and it was one of the weakest pieces on the board. It could only move one square diagonally.
So Shatranj must have been an incredibly long, slow game.
Oh, extremely slow, methodical. Checkmate was often this tedious process, requiring dozens of tiny, subtle moves. But then, in the late 15th century, mostly in Valencia, Spain, that advisor was recast as the powerful queen.
And this created what some people call Mad Queen's chess.
That's right, it was a strategic shock to the system.
But why? Why that massive jump in power, and why then?
Well, historians link it pretty strongly to the political and cultural zeitgeist. I mean, this was the age of powerful female rulers like Isabella I of Spain and Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Right, women who were actively ruling and waging war.
Exactly. And this was happening at the same time as the cultural growth of the cult of the Virgin Mary. The context sort of demanded that the king have an equally powerful, mobile partner.
And the impact on the game was immediate.
It was revolutionary. The queen suddenly gained the combined movement of both the rook and the bishop. She became by far the most powerful piece on the board. The game got dramatically faster, more aggressive, and way more tactical, almost overnight.
And with the queen's new power, the rest of the rules we know today just sort of locked into place.
Correct. Alongside the queen's power-up, the final key rules were standardized. Pawns could now move 2 squares on their first move, which sped up the opening, and the crucial defensive move of castling was introduced. By the end of the 15th century, that's it. The rules are codified. We have Western chess.
So the board is set, the rules are standardized. What happens next is a battle of ideas, right? How the greatest minds approach this new battlefield. And that brings us to the great strategic eras, starting with the most passionate one, the Romantic era.
The Romantic era, yeah. It dominated from the 18th century well into the late 19th. This was chess as high art. The style was all about being daring, aggressive, and valuing tactical beauty over, clinical efficiency.
So the goal wasn't just to win, it was to win brilliantly, with a flourish.
Exactly. They loved gambit openings, where you intentionally sacrifice a piece, usually a pawn, to gain a massive attack or open up lines. Masters like Gioacchino Greco were famous for it. They'd just give up pieces for a stunning finish.
We're talking about players like Adolf Anderssen and his immortal game.
Anderssen is the perfect example, that swashbuckling style. He famously won a game after sacrificing his queen and both of his rooks just to deliver checkmate. It was all about flash. But, not everyone was a fan of this purely sacrificial approach.
And this brings us to the first major strategic pioneer, François-André Denikin Philidor.
Philidor, an 18th century French master, was just miles ahead of his time. While everyone else was looking for the immediate knockout punch, he was focused on the long game. On defense, he famously said, "Pawns are the souls of chess."
That's a fantastic quote. Why elevate the pawn, the weakest piece, to the soul of the game?
Because he was the first to really understand that pawn structure, how your pawns are arranged, is the absolute bedrock of your position. He realized good pawn structure protects your pieces, it restricts your opponent's pieces, and crucially, it's the key to winning the endgame. He basically invented modern endgame theory.
So the shift from artistic flair to scientific rigor really comes with the first official world champion.
That would be Wilhelm Steinitz, crowned in 1886. Steinitz launches the scientific or positional era. He was revolutionary because he replaced the romantic reliance on these speculative brilliant attacks with deep, systematic calculation.
What was at the core of Steinitz's philosophy?
His core idea was simple. Never attack until you've built up a clear, long-term advantage. He focused on accumulating small edges, things like king safety, good pawn structure, and the strength of the bishop pair.
Okay, I have to pause you there. We hear the bishop pair all the time in chess commentary. What makes having 2 bishops so much better than, say, a bishop and a knight? Give us the quick primer.
That's a great question, because it really defines positional play. Okay, so a knight can hit squares of any color, but a single bishop is stuck on squares of one color for the whole game, right? White or black.
Right.
The bishop pair means you control diagonals of both colors across the entire board. And when the position opens up, Those two long-range bishops working together can be absolutely devastating. They can control so much more territory than a knight. That was a key Steinitz concept.
That systematic approach must have felt pretty restrictive to some players, though, who challenged it.
That would be the hypermodern school. This is around the turn of the century. Players like Aaron Nimzovich and Richard Reddy. And they fundamentally questioned Steinitz's classical idea that you must occupy the center with your pawns right away.
What was their alternative? It sounds pretty radical.
It was. They advocated for controlling the center from a distance. Use your pieces, not your pawns. They often used a setup called the fianchetto.
Okay, the fianchetto, that's when you move the pawn in front of the knight and tuck the bishop onto that long diagonal, right? How did that upend Steinitz?
Well, Steinitz demanded immediate physical control of the center. The hypermoderns, using the fianchetto, put immense pressure on the center from the wings. It was like fighting the main battle from the trenches. It showed that control didn't require occupation. It just required influence. It broadened the game tremendously.
But you still had players who could synthesize all of this, right? Combine the best of all these ideas.
Absolutely. Think of a universal master like Jose Raul Capablanca. He was the epitome of clear, positional mastery, famous for this just flawless, simple technique. If he got even the tiniest advantage, he could convert it into a win with machine-like precision.
And this is where the narrative just takes a complete left turn. After World War II, chess stops being just a game or an intellectual pursuit. It becomes a geopolitical weapon.
It absolutely did. The Soviet Union saw chess mastery as the perfect way to demonstrate the intellectual superiority of the communist system. So they poured massive state resources into it. Chess schools, academies, it professionalized the game completely.
And this led to decades of Soviet dominance, starting with champions like Mikhail Botvinnik.
Botvinnik was the first champion of that system, a brilliant, systematic player who was also a high-level engineer. He set the standard. And that dominance set the stage for probably the most iconic moment of the Cold War.
The match of the century, 1972.
That's right. The American prodigy, Bobby Fischer, challenges the Soviet champion, Boris Spassky, in Reykjavik. The political pressure was immense. I mean, Henry Kissinger had to personally call Fischer to convince him to play.
It was a global spectacle.
A huge one. And Fischer's victory was a staggering propaganda win for the West.
And it was Fischer who really weaponized opening preparation, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. He was notorious for his deep study, coming to the board with opening ideas prepared 20 moves deep. He really showed the world the intensity required at that level.
After Fischer came that ultimate modern rivalry, Kasparov versus Karpov. It defined the 80s and 90s.
And across 5 world championship matches, it was a clash of ideologies. Anatoly Karpov was the refined Soviet positional player, a master of slowly squeezing his opponents. And Garry Kasparov was his opposite, a brilliant, dynamic calculator who just pushed the boundaries of aggression and opening theory.
Which brings us to the biggest change since the Queen got her powers, the digital age.
The world turned upside down in 1997. IBM's machine, Deep Blue, defeated the reigning world champion, Garry Kasparov. And this was more than just a loss. It confirmed that machines could outcalculate the best human minds. It was the start of computer dominance.
And now engines like Stockfish and AlphaZero are. They're just on another level. But it hasn't killed the game. If anything, it's made it explode.
It's been radically redefined. The initial fear was that machines would make chess boring. Instead, they revealed entirely new strategic ideas. Then came the online chess boom of 2020, fueled by the pandemic, Twitch streamers, the Queen's Gambit. It brought in millions of new players.
So how does a modern grandmaster play, having been trained by, a silicon god?
The modern style is about universal play and engine influence. For a decade, it was defined by Magnus Carlsen. He synthesizes everything we've talked about. He's known for his phenomenal endgame skill and his stamina, his ability to squeeze wins from positions that look completely drawn moves learned directly from engine analysis.
And history keeps turning.
It does. In 2024, Gukesh Damaraju of India became the new world champion. It signals a return to the game's original homeland, with players who are using that engine preparation to its absolute maximum.
The history of chess really is a mirror of cultural, geopolitical, and technological shifts, from an Indian army simulation to a Cold War battleground, and now to a massive digital sport.
And it raises a really important question for you to consider, because this affects every field, not just chess. Since modern engines have capabilities far beyond our comprehension, the goal of study is no longer to find the single perfect move. The engine can do that. Instead, the goal is to understand the patterns, the counterintuitive connections, the strange strategic truths that the machine reveals. Human learning shifts from calculation to comprehension.
That's a profound thought. How does that kind of technological assistance shape our learning in fields far beyond the 64 squares? Something to mull over until our next deep dive. Thank you for joining us.